I've heard you talk about how psychedelics can help us peel back the layers of reality, kind of get a deeper understanding of what's really down there. Can you talk about that? Like, what can psychedelics reveal about consciousness and reality?
Well, there's a number of things really, and I think on the whole, there's two ways to approach it. I think they can give insights into consciousness generally from a negative point of view, and also they might be able to, if one is open to metaphysical possibilities, then psychedelics can give you an experiential view of these possibilities. So where to start? I mean, number one, psychedelics just reveal to us how powerful the mind can be. I mean, in shocking ways. If you've never taken them, well, you'd be quite amazed because they are far beyond imagination, far beyond dreams or nightmares. The visuals, the complexity of the visuals of like beings, entities, spaceships. Um, just all kinds of things are just. It's just number one, shocking. And so, if you are interested in consciousness, it almost behoves you to look into psychedelic consciousness
I
because it's
agree.
just a data set. It's just a whole new world of mentality, which otherwise, I mean, there are all these kind of stereotypes about LSD just causing kind of like these kind of circular visions and multicolored spirals and so on. And that's it's a very small part of something greater. And most of it, well, a lot of it, you can't even put into words. It's famously ineffable. So you can have another really interesting thing in relation to consciousness is this: you can have experiences that you cannot classify into the modes of experience that we generally have. So you can
Yes.
have experiences which are not concepts, or they're not percepts, they're not colors or sounds or scents or whatever. Yet they're not emotions or feelings. They're not moods. They're not the subconscious drives. There's something
Yes.
completely different, but at the same time, very intense,
Yes.
bizarre, very intense. But of course, you can't express it in words because we haven't created words for these kind of non-prosaic states. That in itself is interesting because I don't know. For example, Jaegwon Kim, this great philosopher of mind, died a few years ago. He said, like, why do we have these qualia and not others? This remains a mystery, right? So why do we have, like, for electromagnetism, why do we have color? Why not sound or
Right.
smell? Or all right, or for airwaves, why do we have sound? Why not something else? And then, but we do have colors. Let's say for electromagnetic frequencies, um, or for movement in the visual cortex, or all of it combined. But why colors for things? Why not something completely different? So long as it makes practical life operational. So if we can navigate the world, you don't necessarily need to see it in terms of colors. Maybe other creatures don't. But anyway, so psychedelics kind of show you these other possibilities. Very very fascinating. But it's hard to remember them even because you can't latch onto them concepts or words and so on. In the negative sense, psychedelics kind of rule out a number of theories of consciousness. So, much of the 20th century was beholden to this theory of behaviorism, in psychology with Skinner, and in philosophy, logical behaviorism with Ryle and people like that. And it's the view that there's no such thing as consciousness, really. Really, all consciousness is, or a mental state is, simply behavior of some kind. So happiness is smiling, But, you take a few magic mushrooms and lie down, and you don't move at all, you don't behave at all, but you travel galaxies and meet aliens and whatever, right? So it kind of sort of, I think, disproves that theory quite radically. Also, there's interesting issues about multiple realization with psychedelics. So multiple realization means that the same mental state can be realized in different ways, so you probably know about this more than I do, but so have you ever heard of the Lorber case? This case of this math student who didn't have a brain but just functioned normally and could see and so on.
No, I don't
They had,
think the specific case, but I've always been fascinated with these.
yeah, but you said they didn't have the prefrontal cortex or anything, visual cortex or anything like this. They had a thin film of neurons on the underside of their skull, but nonetheless, their mental functionings were realized in different ways, right? So you know, somehow. And hunger, the classic example of philosophy is that hunger can be realized in multiple ways. So in humans,
Yes.
it sort of relates presumably to something within our brains and body, but in an octopus, something very different. But you wouldn't want to deny hunger to an octopus, right? This is
Yeah.
Hilary Putnam's argument against identity theory. But so with psychedelics, you can have like very qualitatively similar experiences, but with drugs that are act in very different ways on the brain. So, you know, you have a lot of the classic psychedelics act on serotonin receptors, but salvia divinorum, for example, doesn't. Acts in a very different way, but yet the experiences are somewhat similar, you know, which is in itself quite fascinating, and perhaps reveals kind of you know, necessary and sufficient conditions of human consciousness, you know. Also, another interesting aspect of consciousness research with regard to psychedelics is that in relation to Huxley and Bergson. So, in one of the reasons that Westerners became interested in psychedelics in the 20th century, after James in the early 20th century, was with Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, where he takes mescaline and then writes about it and tries to understand it through a philosophical frame, many frames really. But what Huxley does is he uses his French philosopher Henri Bergson, his radical theory of consciousness, to understand his mescaline experience. And Bergson's theory basically is that perception is it's like to use Huxley's term, a reducing valve or a filter. So, you know, what we see is just really a small fragment of what's out there. We've evolved a certain way to see just, you know, like the colors that are useful to us, you know, but we don't
Yes.
see ultraviolet red. I think most people accept this today. But what Bergson argued more controversially was that the brain doesn't create these colors and sounds either. It receives them from out there. So colors actually are out there, which for many people sounds obvious, right? The grass is actually green. For a philosopher and a neuroscientist, imagine that's a controversial statement, right?
Yes.
Because the greenness is rather the general idea, as you know, is, you know, electromagnetism, light hits the eye, goes to the visual cortex, and then somehow magically emerges, right, as a color. But for Bergson, the color is actually out there, and we absorb that color into us when we look. And so here's a question for you, actually, right? And I work with neuroscientists like Leo Roseman at Exeter and Alex Shaw and people like that. Anyway, we had for our student, we got an MSc in psychedelics. It's called Psychedelics, Mind, Medicine, and Culture, actually. So we do look at consciousness in relation to this. You know, I explained that Bergson's filter theory of consciousness. We filter out mind at large, what he calls mind at large. So mind is out there. We filter a small fraction for our trickle of consciousness here. But it sort of means that the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but receives it, or at least receives mental states. How could you devise an experiment to test this very basic difference? Does the brain generate or receive consciousness? Right? You think something that basic would be testable, but actually it turns out not to. I mean, I've got hope that there is a way of testing it. Actually, you know,
Yeah.
it would be a really interesting experiment, but it's not immediately obvious how that would be done.
No, it's not. Like,
And so that's the thing that, you know, that as you ask, you know, what does psychedelics bring to the state of consciousness? That's not an interesting question, right? So,
yeah, I've so much to say on everything that you said there, and I absolutely love it. One thing that you might be very interested in is I've done this process of experience sampling. So this was developed by a psychologist called Russell Hurlburt in like the 1970s to basically try and get at subjective experience. So I've been carrying around this box that was literally, you know, made 55 years ago with one purpose of I'll turn it on and it will beat me 6 times per day. And I will write down my experience in that moment. So I was thinking about these things. I had this image in my mind of a castle and a lawn and a wall, and I have to write down exactly what I saw. So you're really trying to get at the aspects of experience, and it's a really hard process. For one, like you said, like we just don't have words for most of these things. Like I was feeling euphoria in my body, but like yeah, just doesn't really match. Like that's sort of what it feels like, but it doesn't really match. So I did that for 10 weeks to get at my experience. But the part that you might be very interested in is that I did one sampling session on LSD.
Oh, really?
And I found that it was totally impossible. Like it was just entirely impossible to get at what was happening in
Yeah.
any way. The language just didn't work. Like the only way I could say it that in any language was like every single cell in my body was vibrating with positive euphoria and energy, and it was excited in an emotional way on a cellular level, and I could feel it sort of radiating from like a central core all the way down like a gradient to all of my different limbs and everything. But it was like I could feel the excitement in every single cell. And I kind of realized that even that there's some might be some aspects of that that are kind of roughly true, but the language none of it fit. And it was so
Yeah.
hard to do, and I was so unconfident writing down. I was like, I don't know, like the plant was sort of like an octopus in a strange way, but it doesn't work. And I was trying to explain this to two neuroscientists that have never done psychedelics. And they were like really pleased with my results, being like, "Oh yeah, I think we described your experience." And I was like, "Guys, I don't think we got at it at all. Like it's just so it's the
I
language
mean,
just doesn't do it
yeah.
justice. It's so hard. There isn't a word for these things. Like even I
No.
think in a normal sober state, there isn't even words for these things. And then you go and psychedelics just explode every dimension of human experience into like 1,000 extra dimensions that you didn't even know existed. And then
Yeah.
and then you try and put a word on it, it's like, nah, that word just doesn't do it justice. It might be the best word, but it's still so far away from that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, William James said mystical states are ineffable, right? Exactly that. Well, also actually, Humphrey David did. But, it brings along another interesting intellectual point, which is that to get to understand what's going on in the brain, right, you need a good phenomenology and good taxonomy of states, right? And then so someone says, I'm experiencing this now, and then you sort of, you correlate that to the fMRI or whatever it is. But if you haven't got words for it, you can't express it, right? And then therefore
Yeah.
you can't find the correlates either.
So he
Um,
tries to break these phenomena down into these five frequent phenomena. And he kind of doesn't like the framework because it chunks experience together, right? You like have an experience and then you're kind of forced to like squish it into a label. And I think they're roughly correct, but it still doesn't work. But then
mm,
if you don't have labels for anything, like how do you develop a science? Like how do you actually develop a field? How do you make any claims or do anything ever if you can't actually
yeah,
say that this thing was this label? And no
yeah.
label feels right. But then, like, I genuinely don't know how you make progress in a field when every attempt to put a label on it just doesn't work.
No, you're right. I mean, there are questionnaires which try, but they always are inadequate. There's something called microphenomenology, which sort of tries to really get it stops you every 10 minutes when you're on the trip and says, "What you're feeling now, write it down in detail." But even that, I feel that probably affects the trip in a negative way.
Yeah,
And even then, it's using words, right? So it will never be fully adequate. And if you believe in the ineffability of certain psychedelic experiences, then you'll never ever be able to report it perfectly. But maybe you can get closer. So you can get, like you're saying already, like broad swathes. So, at least can give you some information. Um, but yeah, no, it's difficult to study. I mean, it's difficult to study the mind for the reasons of privacy, like I mentioned, but psychedelic mind even more so. And at the same time, though, you don't need to understand exactly how things work in order to create medicines, right? So, like general anesthetic, we don't really understand how that works, but we do use it. And the same with psychedelics. So, they are now being used as medicines in the West, and we've got a Home Office license to use them, even to experiment with them. So, they are in progress, and the law's changing. So, regardless of all these things, um,
not changing fast enough, in my opinion, and I think you would
no, no,
agree. But
no, but it is changing, and drug science are doing. David Nutt's organization is doing good work in Britain on it. But I mean, cannabis has been a prescription drug for the last few, 6 years, and people don't even know it's a prescription drug. I think there's only 6 NHS outlets in the whole of Britain for that.
yeah,
Where the law's changed. So most people think it's just still illegal, and yeah, psychedelics will take a while, but I think we're getting there. Um, but another interesting point that brings up, I mentioned this kind of alien qualia before. how many experiences are possible for a human being? If you have all these crazy experiences that you mentioned that you can write down, what is the limit? Is there a limit? Is there a limit, or is the mind infinite
I
in
would
its
I would
capacity?
I would say near infinite, because I think every experience starts in context, right? I've never spoken with you before, so this is a completely unique experience. I know, like, there's a lot of common features in that you're, a very intelligent person that I've had enjoying this conversation with, and I do that a lot. But I've never had an experience of speaking to you before, so in that sense, it is completely unique. And I think just
Okay. Yeah.
the combinatorial permutations of the biological system contribute to our experience in some way, and there's just a near infinite ways that they can be like that they can come together. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's 8 billion flavors of human experience, that no two are the same at all.
Mm. I suppose, yeah, when you meet, yeah, every experience is new, right? Even if it's the same, it will be new in your life in relation to your memory. But I wonder if, at least like when you meet me now online here, I mean, you're still using kind of, colors and sounds and whatever, right? Which you are familiar with, at least the types. But I wonder how far mind can go in terms of like different types, like I mentioned, like different types of experience that we just are generally not aware of at all. Is that infinite? I mean, if you're a Platonist, you'd say it is infinite. That these types exist out there, like with the Pythagorean theorem, this strange sort of timeless realm that we sometimes ingress. That's when you get this other form of theory of mind that you perceive not only the things that are outside of you, but you add types from this eternal realm. And you get into Plato there, but also a lot of logicians believe that, like Frege and Gödel, and the basis of his incompleteness theorems, and Whitehead and early Russell. But yeah, no, they are deep, deep metaphysical questions. I mean, people have been arguing about these, like, do people discover or invent mathematical truths, right? It's been debated for 3,000 years.
Yeah.
And I think let's bring back that debate to a certain extent. Also, you touched upon something there, context. I mean, this is another interesting debate which psychedelics brings to consciousness studies, which is, um, people like Huxley and William James, they believe that in perennialism, there's this peak experience which is qualitatively identical amongst all peoples at all times, universalism, as it were. And this is opposed to contextualism, which is the view that actually not just the interpretation, but the very experience itself is completely dependent upon one's context.
Yes.
Someone in the British Isles will, have some kind of monotheistic experience, perhaps. Someone in the jungle in America will experience something very different. And, it's an ongoing debate. It started really in the 70s with Stephen Katz, but psychedelics have brought it back. There's a great paper on it by Kurt Beyer, actually. But yeah, is the mind completely dependent on its context, or is there some kind of universality to it? Interesting question. How would you prove it one way or the other? There's a third way probably as well, which I'm sort of more, like favorable towards. But what psychedelics generally do, I think, is that they're like almost like let's say a kind of star about which all of these questions of consciousness revolve. They kind of they don't. I don't think psychedelics experience necessarily proves anything, but
Yeah.
brings into play all of these different issues in
That's
very
that's what
interesting
I
ways.
that's what I struggle with psychedelics, in separating fact from fiction, right? Because I've
Mm.
experienced, or again, what I experienced as universal consciousness is almost definitely is different than your experience of universal consciousness. But say they might have some commonalities in feature, like this connectedness with the world, a rich connectedness with nature, a wanting to donate money to save the red pandas, whatever it is. There's some connectedness there. But
Yeah.
then at the same time, I saw my plant turning into an octopus. So it's like
Yeah.
what feels like a true universal consciousness, and I think maybe what pushes some people towards these radical ideas of consciousness, I think I've experienced in some way, although there's definitely differences. But then,
Mm.
like, how do you separate that fact from fiction, from the fact that your plant is now waving at you?
Yeah.
Or,
Well,
I even just saw a tweet today from Paul Stamets that there's this mushroom that they're trying to find in Papua New Guinea that's causing these Lilliputian hallucinations. These fascinating, interesting psychedelic effect that has like these little people see these tiny like figurines kind of running around, and we don't really
Mm.
know why people seem to have these hallucinations, and it seems to
Very common,
operate.
though.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
like
you get in
why the
China
hell is that?
where this Chinese community found mushrooms and saw little people, and of course you get it in the Amerindian cultures as well. You know, the Shapiri, for example, the Yanomami people, and so on, little beings, entities, and of course with DMT, you know, little elves,
Yeah,
jokers. You know,
exactly. I was
it's
going to
it's
bring up the DMT elves as
it's
well. Like, how do you
yeah.
separate fact from fiction here? You know, are these little people some at some deeper bedrock of reality? Are the mischievous mechanical DMT elves at the bedrock of reality, or is it all just hallucinations the whole way down?
Well, there's a deep epistemic issue, right? And I'm open-minded about all of this. I don't know the answer, but I'll just preface this with two things. First of all, certainly psychedelics do induce hallucinations at the least, but that doesn't mean they're not. They're always delusions, just like normal perception. Generally, we think we're seeing the real world, but every now and again, you think you see a friend, but it's actually someone else. You know, it's
Yep.
very common. The delusions in our everyday perceptions. And that doesn't mean, therefore, when I look at this book over here, it's a delusion as well, right? So that's one just core logical point. The other important point really is that the word delusion or hallucination is relative to the concept reality. And we can only say something's a delusion if we know what reality is.
Yeah, true.
And as we've been speaking, we've realized. Well, I've realized. Well, we both know already, but that there is massive disagreement on what reality is. You know, in terms
Yes.
of how matter relate. You know, and so without knowing that, you can't really definitively say that something's a delusion. Obviously, the probability, you know, like of like flying pandas in front of your face, you know, on as being delusions. But there are other aspects, like for example, you know, more classical mystical states where you think that your ego yourself dissolves and you sort of immerse into a larger consciousness. I mean, this is not obviously a delusion if you look at certain thought like Spinoza, that there's this, you know, infinite intellect, or even like extended mind theories, which are doing the rounds today, you know, that our consciousness is not dependent just on our brain, nervous system, and body, but also uh, with the external things in our environment. You know, there's this, in other words, there's really physical correlates of consciousness rather than neural or even biological correlates of consciousness, you know, arguably. But anyway, so and you know, these things change, our understandings change, fashions change, and so you know, you have to be open-minded with these deeper questions about psychedelic consciousness, I think, generally. So idealism, you know, everything's conscious, or pantheism, panpsychism, nature connectedness. There are good reasons, like intellectually, to believe in these things. So they're not obviously delusions. And that's just another important point to say, that you can study metaphysics intellectually, like reading Spinoza, or you can experience them. So you get intellectual metaphysics and experiential metaphysics. Deleuze, the French philosopher, said with regard to Spinoza's monism, he said you can spend years studying the conceptual apparatus of Spinoza, or you can get it in a flash, like an intuition like that, right? Two different ways of perhaps the same truth.
Right.
But Lilliputians, yeah, this
Yeah.
is something that
That's
we stumble.
utterly bizarre, isn't it? It's
I've never.
utterly, totally bizarre. And
It's really. Yeah.
they don't
I
seem to be able to know what they can't find the mushroom or the psychoactive compound, and they think it might be a separate mechanism than the standard, more traditional psilocybin route. I think they don't know, and there might be some disagreement on this. But like
Right.
that would mean that mushrooms themselves independently evolved different ways to get us into psychedelic states, which is just again kind of utterly bizarre. Like, what do mushrooms? Why are they doing this? It's and the fact that
Yeah,
there's
it's
consistency
weird.
in these Lilliputian hallucinations and the DMT elves is also just super interesting to me. Like, why on earth would that be?
It's really interesting. I listened to my friend Andrew Gallimore on Joe Rogan a few weeks ago. He speaks about you know, he's a computational neurobiologist who's got created this DMT X machine where you get constant injections of DMT, you know, for the fuller experience.
Wow.
It's very often elvish or insectoid or some kind of beings, but it's a strange thing actually, that sometimes these beings come to you, these jokers or elves or whatever, And there was one instance where they said, right, that's it, you've had enough. And then the participants' experience just stopped, even though the DMT was being constantly pumped in, strangely. Here's another interesting question about psychedelics with regard to consciousness, mental causation again, right? So there are these groups trying to develop so-called pseudodelics, right? So they've got this molecular structure, base structure of a psychedelic molecule, but without the phenomenology, without the experience. So they believe that the therapeutic potential of a psychedelic is purely physiological.
All right.
Physical causation. And I think it's marketable because some people, want to, lose their depression, but they don't want to go to outer space or something, right? Kind of understandable. But the interesting question there is, well, isn't the experience actually the therapeutic mechanism?
I think the data says it is. I've spoken to experts here where they do these mystical experience questionnaires, and the parts of the mystical experience that are best correlated with the alleviation of depressive symptoms are mystical experiences, and they're more tightly correlated than any of the other experiential dimensions that you possibly can list down in these questionnaires. I think the data would support the fact that the experience is the crucial part.
Data and anecdote. You meet people who've had this one-off amazing experience and changed their lives, right, in terms of mental health benefits. But so it does seem that the experience itself is the mechanism.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free